Hello again, Professor Sackett-Taylor here. This is my first video lecture in the series that I'm creating for Econ 321 Natural Resource Economics in fall of 2021. So this first video lecture is covering content from Environmental and Natural Resource Economics, a Contemporary Approach. And this specific video is focused on Chapter 1, Changing Perspectives on the Environment. So there are a couple of important historical markers to note when we're trying to provide the context for where we are today as it relates to environmental policy and natural resource management. So people really were not very aware that there were problems with environmental degradation until the 1960s. In 1962, Rachel Carson, who was a biologist, published her book called Silent Spring. And in this book, she laid out for people how, because of the excessive pesticide use in modernized agriculture, it was destroying ecosystems that were home to many birds. And so those bird species were in decline. And this book actually became very popular and is often credited with kind of starting the modern environmental movement. So in the 1960s, we saw the passage of the Wilderness Act, which was basically one of the first pieces of extensive legislation to protect public land from being turned into industrial use. And late in the 1960s and 1969 was another big awakening moment for people when the Cuyahoga River in Ohio became on fire. And this was because the water over time had become so polluted with oil and other flammable chemicals that the water itself caught fire. And this kind of made people more aware of the issue of water pollution and eventually led to the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was created by President Richard Nixon in 1970. And that same year was the first time that as a country we celebrated Earth Day. Let's see here. So in the late 1970s and up through the mid 80s was when we became first very aware of the impacts of nuclear energy, partially because of the accident that happened at 3 Mile Island, where a nuclear reactor had partially melted down and created like a huge amount of nuclear waste and radiation. And then we saw in 1986 in Chernobyl, which was in the then Soviet Union, we actually saw a nuclear reactor explode. And so people had a heightened awareness of the dangers of using nuclear energy. It wasn't until 1987 when we really had a single cohesive determination of what it meant to be sustainable, or what we thought of as sustainable development, really defining it. That came out of the United Nations Brundtland Commission. And basically we use this same definition for sustainable development to this day. And it says that sustainable development meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So that's complex, and we'll dig deeper into that together in some discussion. But between the 80s and the 90s, we didn't really see any strong movement on global climate change or sustainability until 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was first negotiated. This was the first of its kind. It's an international treaty that had certain nations who signed on committing to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. The United States did not sign on to this treaty, but it was ratified by 191 other nations and actually put into force or put into action in the mid-2000s, 2005. By the early 2000s, we realized that we were kind of at a crossroads when it came to climate change, and that if we were not going to take some drastic action, we were eventually going to get to a point where the damage that we had done to the planet's ecosystems was going to be irreversible. And this is when we started to see people concentrating on sustainable development with a three-tiered approach, looking at sustainable development from an economic lens, a social lens, and an environmental lens. So in 2009, all of the nations who had participated in the Kyoto Protocol came back together in Copenhagen to discuss climate change and agree to new actions that would be implemented to limit global warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius. But no binding commitments were made. It was just kind of like a good faith agreement. The most recent version of these kinds of talks about global climate change was in 2015, which is the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement was approved by 195 countries. And this agreement really was focusing on capping all greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. So where did we stand with this Paris Agreement? Well, in 2015, when the initial talks were going on, our country was led by President Barack Obama, and he joined, as the representative of the United States, joined over 200 other countries to committing to this very ambitious global action plan to combat climate change. In 2020, then President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement, as well as a number of other actions that he took, which began to dismantle decades of environmental policy. Fortunately, in 2021, under some of his first executive orders, now President Joe Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement, but we're still working to undo some of the damage done during the Trump presidency in terms of removing some really important environmental policies that had been in place. So the Paris Agreement is a commitment from all of the major emitting countries. These are usually industrialized Western countries to cut their climate pollution. And over time, those commitments become more serious. It provides a pathway for the developed nations to assist the developing nations with their climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. So it's really a framework for transparent monitoring and enforcement, reporting, and continuously increasing the severity of these restrictions that we're putting on greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so there's a lot going on, and it's been a roller coaster ride over the past few decades in terms of how much we are aware of the environmental issues that the human race is creating, but also this conflict that is perceived between economic development and environmental health. There's often a kind of belief that we cannot simultaneously grow our economies and maintain the health and well-being of environmental systems. So we need new perspectives. This is where there really tends to be a fracturing within subdisciplines of economics about how we approach these issues. So there are 2 subdisciplines in economics related to the management of natural resources. There is a contingency of environmental economics. This is a field of economics that really tries to apply very traditional mainstream economic theories and principles to environmental and natural resource issues. There is a newer contingency of economists that subscribe to a ecological economic lens. And this is really an interdisciplinary approach. It brings together viewpoints from a bunch of different academic disciplines, including, ecology, environmental science, geology, geography, like all of the earth sciences, and says we need to view the economic system not as if it was separate from the environmental system, but in fact, the economic system is a subset or a system within a system that is subject to the biophysical laws of this earth. So in environmental economics, we focus very much on the theory of externalities, the optimal management of public goods and common property resources. We do this with a look at allocation over time, and we specifically use economic instruments to place a monetary value on environmental goods and services. All of this is good and well and needed, but ecological economics really takes a much broader, more inclusive lens. First, like I said before, it sees the economic system as a subset of the ecological system within which it's contained. And it takes a stance that sustainability should be defined according to ecological criteria, not economic criteria, because the economy does not exist without the environment. It also really relies very heavily on a range of academic disciplines to each bring their own expertise in addition to economics so that we can have a more thorough, holistic view of the environmental issues that we're facing. So let me put this into a framework that you're more familiar with. Maybe it's been a long time, or it has been a long time since you've taken a principles course, but back in the day, you were first introduced to the circular flow diagram, which you see here. It basically says all goods and services are produced and consumed in a single market where firms are the seller and households are the buyer. And the way that those goods and services are produced is through the use of inputs, which come in the form or categories of land, labor, and capital, in which households are the seller and firms are the buyer. And it goes round and round and round with monetary payments being made in exchange for the production, use, and eventual transaction of these goods and services. This is really limited because you can ask yourself here, like, these are nice, like the only place that environment shows up here is in that word land. And it's kind of hidden, and it doesn't take into account that we use the environment as what I'm going to call a source and a sink for our economic behavior. A source, meaning we extract things from the environment and use it as a source or an input for our economic activity. But then all of our economic activity doesn't come without waste. We create a lot of pollution. And so all of our economic activity also therefore uses the environment as a sink or a placeholder or a place to just fill up with the waste from our production. So this is the expanded circular flow model that takes into account that circular flow diagram as being contained within ecological cycles. And this includes both the inputs from the economy as well as the outputs from the economy in the form of pollution and waste. And it also recognizes that these things cannot grow infinitely because there is a planetary boundary, that the environment is not infinite, it is fixed and finite. And so this becomes a bounded system rather than an unbounded one. And it really emphasizes the limit of the availability of natural resources, as well as the limit of the ability of the environment to assimilate our waste and pollution. So is there a different way to think about this? Yes. And I'd love to watch this short video.
Living systems have been around for a few billion years and will be around for many more. In the living world, there's no landfill. Instead, materials flow. One species' waste is another's food, Energy is provided by the sun, things grow, then die, and nutrients return to the soil safely. And it works. Yet as humans, we've adopted a linear approach. We take, we make, and we dispose. A new phone comes out, so we ditch the old one. Our washing machine packs up, so we buy another. Each time we do this, we're eating into a finite supply of resources and often producing toxic waste. It simply can't work long term. So what can? If we accept that the living world's cyclical model works, can we change our way of thinking so that we too operate a circular economy? Let's start with the biological cycle. How can our waste build capital rather than reduce it? By rethinking and redesigning products and components, and the packaging they come in, we can create safe and compostable materials that help grow more stuff. As they say in the movies, no resources have been lost in the making of this material. So what about the washing machines, mobile phones, fridges? We know they don't biodegrade. Here, we're talking about another sort of rethink, a way to cycle valuable metals, polymers, and alloys so they maintain their quality and continue to be useful beyond the shelf life of individual products. What if the goods of today became the resources of tomorrow? It makes commercial sense. Instead of the throw away and replace culture we've become used to, we'd adopt a return and renew one, where products and components are designed to be disassembled and regenerated. One solution may be to rethink the way we view ownership. What if we never actually owned our technologies? We simply licensed them from the manufacturers. Now, let's put these two cycles together. Imagine if we could design products to come back to their makers, their technical materials being reused and their biological parts increasing agricultural value. And imagine that these products are made and transported using renewable energy. Here we have a model that builds prosperity long term. And the good news is, there are already companies out there who are beginning to adopt this way of working. But the circular economy isn't about one manufacturer changing one product. It's about all the interconnecting companies that form our infrastructure and economy coming together. It's about energy. It's about rethinking the operating system itself. We have a fantastic opportunity to open new perspectives and new horizons. Instead of remaining trapped in the frustrations of the present, with creativity and innovation, we really can rethink and redesign our future.
So I invite you in this class, although this class is called Natural Resource Economics, I really invite you to take an ecological economic view or a lens of the world. And instead of using economic value based on people's willingness to pay, how might we think about using both economic value and inherent value, value that's based on ethics, rights, and justice? Instead of converting all value to monetary terms, what if some values, especially those inherent values, could be expressed in a non-monetary way and actually matter to the people who had decision-making power? What if instead of only advocating for market-based solutions, we also recognize that sometimes those micro-level market solutions fail to address macro-level issues, and it takes government intervention and people to make major changes? What if instead of only using weights in our equations to represent future generations, we actually took them into account in a more significant way based on ethical consideration? Instead of aiming for our economics to be value neutral and completely objective, let's be subjective, right? Having ethics, having morals, having belief systems, having values should be acceptable in a pluralistic framework. Instead of maintaining just the well-being of humans over time and thinking about that as sustainability, we need to maintain all ecological function over time and reframe our conversations about sustainability, putting the environment first, not people. And finally, instead of thinking that economic growth is limitless and that we can just keep growing indefinitely, we need to recognize the planetary boundaries that we live with, that there's a carrying capacity to the earth that we call home, and that we very likely cannot continue to grow our economies forever. So where does economic policy come in? National and global environmental issues are some of our biggest challenges that we face as a society today. And understanding these challenges is going to require that we have this foundational knowledge set about economics and the environment. And so policies that are aimed at environmental protection do come with economic costs and economic benefits, and we should consider those. The economic dimension is so crucial to determining which policies we actually adopt. In lots of cases, if not all of them, it'll involve a trade-off between economic goals and environmental goals. And so sometimes these goals will be incompatible, but sometimes they will be mutually reinforcing. And so that's what I'm inviting you to do this semester with your research project. Where are ways where we can take an ecological lens, put the environment first, and think about our economic policies in a way that becomes mutually reinforcing so that we are enhancing the well-being of humans and the societies we live in, while also protecting the environment. So before we meet to talk about this chapter, I invite you to think and reflect on this discussion question. Is it possible to put a monetary price on every environmental resource? And if so, how would we do that? Are there cases where it's impossible? Could you identify specific instances of valuing an environmental good or service that you're familiar with and that you've read about? If so, bring those examples to talk about when we meet in class, and I'll see you then.